So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CID Speaker Series. My name is Sarah Luttrell. I'm the Communications and Events Manager at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. I greatly look forward to today's discussion on the power of creative destruction and how to achieve sustained, greener, and more inclusive prosperity for all. The format for today's session is a 20 to 25-minute presentation, and we'll leave around 15 minutes for Q&A. That being said, before we get started, I'd like to just mention a few housekeeping items. So during the Q&A session, you can submit your questions directly into the chat or using the raise your hand function in Zoom. We're also recording today's session, as you may have noticed, and the video of today's event will be available on CID's YouTube channel. I will also add links in the chat to sign up for CID's newsletter and for our social media channels to hear more about events like this and the research at CID. Our next speaker series event is on Friday, October 1st with Diane Calvi, who is the president and CEO of Village Enterprise. She'll be speaking on entrepreneurship, innovation, and evidence to drive poverty alleviation. So we hope you'll join us for that event as well. But without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Philippe Aghion. So Philippe is a professor at the Collège de France and the London School of Economics and a fellow at the
INSEAD.
At INSEAD. Yes, thank you for the clarification there. And he is also a fellow of the Econometric Society and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His research focuses on the economics of growth, and he will be presenting today on his latest book, The Power of Creative Destruction, which draws on theory and evidence to examine some of today's most fundamental economic questions, including the roots of growth and inequality, competition and globalization. And there Philippe is sharing the book with us, technological revolutions, secular stagnation, middle income traps, and climate change. So today we'll discuss those insights in the post-COVID context and how to rethink the future of capitalism. So thank you all for being here. And Philippe, I will hand it over to you.
Sarah, thanks so much for introducing me and for organizing this. It's a pleasure to be here, and I will just now do the slideshow. Well, exactly. That's so. So in fact, this book called "The Power of Creative Destruction" is based on more than 30 years of research since we started, to develop a Schumpeterian growth paradigm with Peter Howitt in 1987. To operationalize Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction and to so that we could have a framework that we could confront to micro data in particular, to confront the many predictions of this paradigm. So then what happened is that I taught at Collège de France, and Collège de France for the past 5 years. And Collège de France is a place a bit like the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, but you teach the public. You give public lectures and you have to present frontier knowledge, frontier research in a way which is accessible to the public at large. So it forced me to, and forced us with the help of Céline Antonin and Simon Brunel to put this, all this research that had been done over the past 30 years by we started with Howitt, but then several co-authors of ours, and then new generations of fantastic researchers working on this. And we present all that in that book. So Céline Antonin is a researcher at Sciences Po and Collège de France, and Simon Brunel is a researcher at INSEAD, Banque de France and Collège de France. So creative destruction is the process whereby new innovations displace old technologies, whereby new innovations make old technologies obsolete. This concept was introduced by Joseph Schumpeter, okay? But there was no model. I mean, when I started with economics, I thought that was a brilliant idea. But I asked, where is the model? There was no model. Where is the empirics? There was no empirics. So what we did with Howitt in 1987 is to develop a growth model that encompasses the creative destruction idea. So what we call now the Schumpeterian growth paradigm, which has become, I think, the dominant paradigm in growth economics nowadays, is based on three main ideas. The first idea is that long-run growth is driven by a cumulative process of innovation, where each innovator builds upon the giant shoulder of our predecessor, the shoulder of giants of our predecessor. Okay, and the second idea is that innovation do not come from heaven; they result from entrepreneurial activities motivated by the prospect of innovation once. And the third idea is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technology. And you see right away that at the heart of the growth process to creative destruction, there is a contradiction. On the one hand, you need innovation rents, which are like temporary monopoly rents, to motivate innovation. You see, because I innovate so that I can acquire these innovation rents. Okay, but on the other hand, those rents can be used ex post to prevent subsequent innovation, because I don't want myself to be a victim of creative destruction. So you see, you have to guarantee innovation rents to innovators, but make sure they won't use those rents to prevent subsequent innovation to happen and to prevent them from blocking new entry. And in fact, Schumpeter was pessimistic about the future of capitalism because he thought that the first innovators would turn into conglomerates that would block subsequent innovation. In fact, in this book, we show that there are reasons to be optimistic, but it's a fighting optimism. It's an optimism of the will. And regulating capitalism is all about managing this contradiction. And this contradiction, whether you think about inequality and growth, whether you think about secular stagnation, whether you think about the middle income trap, whether you think about green or not green innovation, whatever you think about, you always come across this contradiction. It's at the heart of everything. And that's what the book is all about. It's about how to deal with this contradiction and how can we overcome and avert the pessimistic prediction of Schumpeter. So what the book does is to use the lens of creative destruction and of the paradigm I just described to do three main things. The first is to revisit some main enigma in economic history. The second one is to question some common wisdom, some wrong policy advice. And the third one is to rethink the future of capitalism. So let me just illustrate on the three. So some historical enigma. So one enigma is on the industrial takeoff. From Madison in particular work, we know that essentially there is not much happening on the growth front until 1820. The true takeoff of growth took place in 1820 in Europe. It's very surprising it didn't take place in China, because China was a country of many inventions, like the wheel, the compass. Many inventions have been done in China long before 1800. But the true takeoff of growth took place in Europe, first England, then France, and then it happened in the United States. But why in Europe and what so recently? And there, we discussed that in chapter 2 of the book, but Joel Mokyr, M-O-K-Y-R, is an unavoidable name there to explain that. And in fact, what's very interesting with Mokyr is that his explanation very much maps the Schumpeterian growth paradigm. First, Mokyr tells you by 1800 in Europe, you have the institutions for cumulative innovation. Why? Because you had printing, the invention of printing, postage progress, but also the encyclopedia. You had the Encyclopedia Britannica in England, and you had the French Encyclopedia of Diderot in France, which would codify knowledge so that new innovators, they would not start from scratch. They could build on previous knowledge. And so that is described in detail, what makes cumulative innovation possible. The second thing is the fact that you had innovation grants could be appropriated by successful innovators. And that was not obvious. It took the Glorious Revolution in England and the French Revolution to set up institutions that would protect property rights on innovation. And that's very important. It would not have happened without the Welsh Revolution and the French Revolution. And the third one is creative destruction. New innovations displace old technology. In China, whenever you would have a new innovator, the emperor would be afraid of his power being threatened by the new innovators, and they would just make life hell to the new innovators. They could never develop their innovation. But in Europe, there is what Mokyr refers to as competition among European countries. If France, for example, would persecute an inventor, the inventor could always go to Switzerland or to Prussia or to England, develop this innovation, which would compete with France, you see. And that competition among European countries made it possible to have sustained creative destruction. It's very interesting that this paradigm explains very well the takeoff, whereas no other paradigm really explains why it happened so late, so recently, and in Europe and other. The second enigma is secular stagnation. It's very interesting if you look at the average TFP growth rate. That's in the US, you see. And you see that between 1995 and 2005, the average yearly TFP growth rate is very high. But then it goes down a lot since 2005. And that's very strange that it happened in spite of the IT and AI revolution. How come? And there, it's very interesting that it happens particularly this up and down of growth of TFP growth in sectors that are IT producing, that's the black curve, and in sectors that are IT using, which is the gray curve. And in fact, the story we developed in chapter 6 of the book is that during the IT revolution, it allowed the emergence of superstar firms like, like Google, Microsoft, then Amazon, then Walmart, and these firms became very big, and they invaded many sectors of the economy because they were well productive. At first, it boosted TFP growth, but then once they invaded all sectors of the economy, it stifled innovation and entry by new firms. And in fact, I can show you what happens to entry and innovation. You see that's entry for you. You see that entry rate of new firms does exactly the same as TFP growth. You see it booming between 1995, 2005, and since 2005, entry rate of new firms has gone down. Why? Because the superstar firms have stifled innovation. And what you need to do to boost growth again in the US is to reform competition policy, to have competition policy adapted to the digital era. And that's very important. In particular, when you decide whether or not to allow for a new merger and acquisition, you should find out whether it prevents or not subsequent innovation and subsequent entry. That's a bit, I think, the recent Biden reforms on competition policy go very much in that direction. You need to adapt institutions and in particular competition policy to the digital era. And then you can put an end to secular stagnation. And that's where we are fighting optimism instead of some who are completely pessimistic. They think it's a lost cause, secular stagnation. We believe it, no, it's not a lost cause. We appropriate competition policy. You can, in fact, resume growth in the US and in other developed countries. Okay, another historical enigma is the source and dynamics of inequality. Very interesting. Here we look at the effect of innovation intensity cross US state panel on various measures of inequality. And what we see is that innovation, more innovation, so we measure innovation intensity by the number of patents weighted by citations. So the same state in the US could be to the left or the right of this here, whether or not you are very intensive on innovation or not very intensive. But you and the continuous black curve is the share of income of the top 1%, is the share of income of the top 1% income earners. And you see that the more innovation there is in the state, the bigger the share of income of the top 1%. And we can show that this relationship is a causal relationship. So this we discussed very much in chapter 5 of the book. And therefore, innovation is a source of top income inequality. And the reason is that I told you, innovation, you get innovation ramps. So it's no surprise. Mr. Skype became rich in Sweden because he invented Skype. He became one of the richest men in Sweden. So that's no surprise that innovation makes you rich. But on the other hand, you see that's very interesting. If I look at the effect of innovation intensity on a more global measure of inequality, which is the Gini measures at the country level how far you are from perfect equality, taking the global population. And you see that innovation has no effect on the global inequality. Why? Because it's true that innovation increases top income inequality. But on the other hand, innovation also increases social mobility. You see here areas in the US that are more innovative, they also find social mobility, which is measured by the expected income of someone born to a poor family, what is her expected income. And social mobility means that even though you have poor parents, you can go very far up the scale of income. And innovation is a source. And why is innovation good for social mobility? Because of creative disruption. Innovation means that you have new innovators, new firms replacing old firms. That spurs social mobility. And we show that in that paper here with Axicit, Bergeau, Blandel, and EMUS, and that we described that in chapter 5, that is particularly innovation by entrance that pushes social mobility. So you see, innovation is very interesting. Innovation is true that it boosts top income inequality, but it also spurs social mobility. And as a result, innovation doesn't increase global inequality. That distinguishes innovation from other sources of top income inequality, like lobbying. Lobbying increases top income inequality, but it also reduces social mobility because you prevent new entrants. And therefore, lobbying also increases global inequality. So we say in the book that you want to distinguish between Steve Jobs, who became rich by, or Mr. Skype, who became rich by innovating, and Carlos Slim in Mexico, who became rich by, being the head of an unregulated monopoly in Mexico, which is Telmex, which is another way to be rich, okay? And they want to distinguish the two. Okay, that's the important thing. Of course, on inequality, it means that should you be worried about the rich? So our view in the book is that it's no problem to have rich people per se, but you want to make sure that they don't prevent competition and new entry. So having rich people is not in itself a problem. What you want to make sure is that the top income earners, they don't use their wealth to prevent new entry, to prevent new innovation. So that's tax policy partly, but it's also competition policy. Make sure they don't lobby too much and they don't also lobby politicians. So you have to act not only on the tax policy, but also on competition policy and the rules to finance political campaigns. And we discussed that a lot in chapter 4 and 6 and 15. Okay, so that's the first part of the book. How long do I have, Sarah, left?
You have about like 5 to 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. So we do two other things in the book. So we say we look at historical enigma. We look at other enigma, the secular stagnation, where some country, the middle income gap, where some country grow fast for a while and then they stop growing. We explain that, and we explain that during the catching up phase of a country, some conglomerates develop that then they don't only oppose new entry, but they also oppose the necessary move to institutions that are good for frontier innovation, like, for example, competition. So we explain that in chapter 7 of the book. So there are many other enigma that we analyze in the book, but I have no time to go into all. Let me talk about common wisdom. There is one common wisdom, which is that you shouldn't tax robots to protect employment. And I want to tell you this is rubbish. Well, I'm doing joint work with Céline Antonin, Simon Bunel, who are the co-authors on this book, and Xavier Jaravel from the London School of Economics. And what we show is that plants and firms in France that automate, they create employment. So you might think that's fine. You robotize or you automate and you create employment. How come? Because automating means that you replace manpower with machines. Yes, but at the same time, when you do that, you become more productive, more competitive. You see the export price here, that's an even study that shows that, at time zero, that's when you automate, and you see employment going up. I show an even study with the price. At the time you automate at time zero, and you see the quality adjusted export price of the firm that automate goes down because you become more productive, more competitive. And because you become more competitive, you increase your market share worldwide, and you see the sales jumping up. And because you have more sales, you demand more labor. So it's true that you have the substitution effect of manpower by machine, but the productivity effect or the competitiveness effect much more than counteract the substitution effect, and therefore you want to let people automate. If you were to put a tax on robots, it would discourage firms from innovating in the sense of automating. It would therefore prevent them from expanding their market worldwide, and therefore from being able to hire more people. So you see, that's what the kind of things we do. We discuss that in chapter 3 of the book. But we discuss also that protectionism is not the way to regain control of value chain, that negative growth is not the way to deal with the global warming, and all that we discuss in the book. Okay, so let me move now to the last part, which is the third thing is to discuss, capitalism. The COVID crisis revealed that the social model in the US is broken, but it also revealed that the European ecosystem does not favor innovation. So already here you can see that the Gini is higher in the US than in Europe, in Western Europe, which means more global inequality in the US. Poverty rate is bigger in the US than in Europe. Okay, here we look at the triangles are the share of unemployed, and unemployment went up during the COVID crisis in the US. That's the gray triangle. But with the circles are the fraction of population without health insurance. In the US, when you lose your employment, you are likely to lose full health insurance. Okay, and so we see that health insurance, the fraction of population without health insurance increased during the COVID crisis in the US. Whereas in Germany, it's the black circle, it remains zero. Everybody gets health insurance. So you see that Germany is better than the US at protecting in terms of health against access to health, against shocks like the COVID. Here we look at the fraction of people into poverty, and the gray circle is the fraction of US population at risk of poverty. It went up during COVID, whereas in Germany, it remained constant through the COVID crisis. Okay, so on the social the US is inferior to Western Europe, particularly Germany and Scandinavian countries. On the other hand, on innovation, US is much better. If you just look at the last column there, the number of biotech patents per million inhabitants is much higher in the US than in Europe or EU, OECD and all that. And that's no question why, because the ecosystem of innovation is much better in the US. In biotech, you have the NSF, you have the NIH, you have the Howard Hughes Medical Institute just for basic research. You have venture capital much more developed than Europe. You have institutional investors much more developed than Europe. You have the BARDA, Biologic Advanced Research Development Agency, to whom we owe Pfizer, Moderna, and all that. We owe to be saved. You spent $12 billion on COVID-related things last year. Europe on total spent $4 billion. Okay, so on innovation, you are much better. So in fact, at the end, America is better on innovation. Europe is better on protection. Some people believe that the lack of protection in the US is the price to pay for US to be innovative. And the lack of innovation in Europe is the price to pay for more protection. I think this is total rubbish. Voilà. I think that's not true. And I will give you 3 instances where you have policies that can both spur innovation, boost innovation, and boost protection and inclusiveness at the same time. So let me give them very quickly. The first one is flex security. Flex security in Denmark means that when you lose your job in Denmark, you get 90% of your salary for 2 years. The state helps you find a new job and they retrain you. And that's the flex security system in Denmark. You don't have such thing in most other countries. Now, you see here, I'm showing you that comes from Uncase and Angus method. It shows the fraction of death of despair among American white non-Hispanics. That's the continuous curve. And you see the mortality due to despair among the middle-aged white non-Hispanics aged 50-54 unskilled in the US went up a lot since 2000. And that's mainly linked to job insecurity, which implies family instability. That's very much what they explain. And people take opioids, sleeping pills, stress, and that's hence the mortality. Obesity, they eat a lot of pizzas and things, and that's how the mortality goes up. Now, in Alexandra Roulet on Denmark, she did some very interesting work. She compares the health of Danish workers whose place of employment closed between 2001 and 2006 with identical workers in all respects, age, experience, skills, but whose place of employment did not close between 2001 and 2006. And that's the effect on, it's a diff and diff. That's the effect of, your plan closing on the purchase of antidepressants compared to the control group. And you see no effect on the purchase of antidepressants for people whose place of employment closed. You see, sleeping pills, antidepressants, no effect of being unemployed in Denmark. No effect of being unemployed in Denmark on the probability to visit hospital for a circulatory problem. And I didn't show you mortality, no effect on mortality. So you see, it's very interesting. If now I invest in a flex security system, I will make creative destruction work better because I make it more efficient. So there will be more creative destruction, but I also protect better workers. So you see, that's the reform that is both for more innovation and more protection. Let me give you another example. It's education. Here I show you the probability of innovating as a function of your parental income. The left curve, the left-hand side curve, is from Bell, Chetty, Jarabel, Petrova, Don Whelan in the QJ in 2019. The middle curve is from that's based on recent US data, and it shows the probability of inventing as a function of the revenue of the parents. The middle one is the probability of inventing as a function of the father's income, and that's from on historical US data going back to 1840 from Axigit, Rigby, and Nicholas. And the right-hand side is based on work I've done with the Axigit, IPIN, and Nitrogen, based on Finnish data. And you see it's like a J curve. You are much more likely to innovate if your parents are high income. And that's also in Finland where schools are free. Why is that? And you can see in Finland, if I control if I don't control for further education and I do the regression of probability on inventing on all the possibilities, the quantiles of the parents, the percentiles of income of the parents, I get this blue curve. If I control for parental education, I get the red curve. So you see a lot is due to the fact it's because high income earners are also more educated. So if you are born to high-income parents, they are also more educated parents. So they transmit knowledge to you, and they also transmit aspirations to you. So that tells you that you should invest for many generations in education. Because if you don't, invest in education for many generations, you will reduce the number of what Chetty et al. Call lost Einstein. They say, in the US, in most countries, you have many people who are very intelligent children, but they are not born in the right family. And so their parents didn't push them. If you were to have very good education system for many generations, it takes a big while, then you will have a more innovative economy because more people can become innovators, but also it's more inclusive because more people can become innovators. And here again, you see, it's not either or between innovation and inclusion. Okay. And the last one is competition. I told you the secular stagnation in the US, okay? And in fact, competition policy adapted to the digital era will not only boost innovation-based growth, but it will also make growth more inclusive because you will have more entrants, which now new entry is going down too much. You see, that's what I showed before. So here are three instances of policy which, when if you implement them, you both make the economy more innovative and more inclusive and protective. At the end, I'm done, and I just want to tell you that the secret and the way to respond to Schumpeter's pessimism is the triangle between firms, which I call market, it's firms, private firms, the state, État, the state, and civil society. Symbols, and when you can talk a lot about this triangle, it's crucial because you see, if you just have the market, innovators of yesterday, they will prevent new innovators. So, of course, you could say the state could regulate them and the state could come. Now you say, well, but the state, the executive power could be captured by the firm. And they are most often. But then you could say, well, Montesquieu could rescue you because he could say, well, you have separation of power. Let's have a judiciary that controls the executive power, okay? And that separation of power would to some extent mitigate the danger of collusion between firms and the executive power. The problem is that the Constitution is an incomplete contract. Nothing guarantees that the Constitution, the Montesquieu rule, will be enforced. And that's where civil society plays a role. Civil society is a watchdog to make sure that the constitutional contract, which is an incomplete contract, is enforced. And that's what we discussed in chapter 15 of the book. And that's why you need a triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. It's this triangle that makes sure that the Schumpeter's pessimistic prediction will be averted. It's this triangle that makes sure that you will have inclusive growth. And it's also this triangle that will make sure that you have green growth. Because for green growth, you need firms to innovate clean, but they don't spontaneously innovate green. We show, and we discussed that in chapter 9 of the book, that firms that innovated in the past in dirty technology, they keep innovating in dirty technology. So you need the state to redirect technical change towards clean technology. But you need the state with civil society, because again, the state could be captured by the incumbent firm. And again, here, civil society will make sure that the state acts on the environment. You see what I mean? And we discussed also the role that consumers and shareholders can have in redirecting technical change towards green technology. There is a role for the state and for civil society to redirect the technical change. Okay, so that's a bit the book, and that's the outline of the book. And I rather stop there, Sarah. No, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Philippe. All very interesting. We have a number of questions in the chat, and we're getting some hand clapping on the emojis here. So wonderful. Well done. I want to have Jessica. She had the first question. If I can ask Jessica to unmute and you can ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. This was very interesting, and I wish we had more time to go into all the detail of your slides. I was a little bit, or I was hoping you could better define what you mean by creative destruction and how you're measuring innovation. And then I also had a question about when you mentioned that countries where there were a greater percentage of people or greater percentage of wealth in the 1%, that this didn't increase the Gini coefficient and because it increased social mobility. So are you saying that countries that have a greater proportion of wealth held by the 1% also have greater social mobility?
No, So let me explain. On the first one, creative destruction is a very concrete thing. I didn't have time to present, but we explained that in chapter 1 and throughout the book. That's a very concrete object. In Schumpeter, it was just a concept. It was the idea that new firms display all technology. How you measure creative destruction in practice? You measure it first from the rate of turnover. You know, you have job creation, job destruction. For example, Davis, Wanger, a lot have developed this kind of measure. So firm turnover or job turnover, that's very much a way to measure creative destruction. But also the flow of new patents is another way to measure, or the flow of new entry of new firms. It's a way of measure of creative destruction. So that's a very concrete measure of creative destruction. Okay, so that's the and we refer to various papers where we look very concretely at the rate of creative destruction using these measures. Okay, but we and all the the people INSEAD, the Clino, and have worked a lot in this. Davis, Wanger. So that's the thing. The second thing, no, I don't say that. When I say that innovation has two effects on inequality. On the one hand, innovation contributes to increasing top income inequality. But on the other hand, innovation, particularly by entrants, increases social mobility. Not only because of the creative destruction, because also we explain in the book, chapter 5, that more innovative firms create more new good jobs, the jobs that promote people. That's when we can show that empirically. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you have it doesn't. So you see, but the point is that you have several sources of top income inequality. One of them is innovation, which is not a bad source because innovation generates growth and also social mobility. But you have a bad source, which is lobbying and entry barrier, because lobbying does all the wrong things. It reduces innovation, therefore growth. It reduces social mobility and it increases global inequality. So you want to fight lobbying, and we talk a lot about the lobbying in the book. Okay. So you want at the same time to boost innovation and to fight lobbying. You want to help the Steve Jobs, but to fight the Carlos Slim. But on the other hand, even the Steve Jobs could turn into a Carlos Slim, we see later on, and he could use his wealth or her to prevent innovation. And for that, you need to have policies like tax policy, competition policy, which we discuss a lot in the book, and rules to finance political campaigns, which should be very regulated. For example, we believe that when the Supreme Court in the US allowed firms to finance political campaigns without limit, that's very bad because it gives a huge incumbency power. We think that's very, very bad. In Europe, in particular in Sweden, a minister had to resign because she paid a Toblerone chocolate with the credit card of the ministry. She had to resign just for that. So we are very strict on financing. And now Sarkozy, where the former president of France is going through terrible turmoil because he overspent on his 2012 campaign. Okay, so that's all that that's that's my response to you.
Great. We have another number of other questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask, and do you prefer to take multiple questions at a time or one question?
Yeah, we can take. Why don't we take multiple?
Okay, so Isaac, I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to unmute you to ask your question directly, and then we'll go to Karim next.
Yes, hello, Philippe. I want to start just by stressing how important the work you've done over the past decades. It's been really so inspirational for many parts of economics. I want to ask you a question on the last part of your presentation. You seem to be suggesting some kind of fusion of the two types of capitalism described by Hall and Soskis, the regulated and the unregulated. So do you see this convergence towards this fusion happening in the two sides of the Atlantic? And given what Hall and Soskis call strategic complementarities between labor market policies, financial sector, goods market, competition, and the inheritance of these things, do you see this convergence happening more easily in the US that's trying to become more social, or in Europe that's trying to become more competitive?
Well, it's a very good question. At least there are attempts, as you noticed. The US is trying to become more inclusive and more protective. At least there is an attempt now. And I welcome, I welcome Biden's reforms. I mean, to be honest, I'm very far, I think it was great. But the other reforms that Biden, both the tax reform and the competition reform, both reforms, in light of the book, were badly needed to make, at least they go in the right direction. Like I welcome Obamacare, which was to make, to improve the health access to public health personally. Now maybe much more needs to be done, and it will take it's complicated. We saw with Obamacare how hard it was to change things, and if you wanted, for example, to establish a flex security system in the US, first it would be from state to state. It would be very hard to do, but I don't know how this will be done. But in Europe, I think what Denmark did is very interesting, and Sweden also took those steps. I mean, those are very egalitarian countries, and in the 90s, since the 90s, they took steps. You see, to before you would overtax capital in. As much as I agree with Biden, you have to increase some tax rate at the top or whatever, or also force some firms to pay higher tax elsewhere. In Sweden, you had excessive taxation, and so of capital and corporate income tax. So they had to reduce there in order to boost innovation. So those reforms were done, and also the flex security reform, I think, was very important reform. So there have been steps in Scandinavian countries, in particular, to make them more innovative while maintaining the social model, essentially. So those are interesting steps. I don't really fully converge, not converge, I can't tell you. But it's interesting that you see in the US, increasing call for being more inclusive, and you see in Western Europe, increasing calls for being more innovative. And COVID made us realize in Europe that really our innovation system was not adequate. That if we don't do something big, the US and China will completely wash us out, and we really need to react on the innovation. So we'll see how far it will go, but at least COVID is a revelation. Yeah.
Great, and Kareem?
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. You talked about the impact of innovation on inequality and social mobility. Yeah. Do we know the impact of innovation on poverty rates? Does more innovation lead to higher poverty rates or lower poverty rates? Do we know about that? Thank you.
That's a very good question, and that's not clear actually. There is no automatic effect of innovation on poverty rates. It's true that the places where you have more innovation tends to be places where you have more social mobility. And we know that more social mobility tends to be related to less global inequality. That's what we call the Great Gatsby curve. And that's shown, cross-country by CORAC at OECD, but it was shown also on cross-commuting zone by Chetty and co-authors in the QJE 2014. That where you have more social mobility, you tend to have less global inequality. So that at least we know. On poverty rates, it's a good question. It's true that it's not automatic that more innovation will reduce poverty on its own. But there are policies that are good. We know also that to get more innovation, education plays a big role. And when you have more education, you have policies that education this policy, for example, of education tends to reduce poverty as much as it spurs innovation. So there are policies that are good for both reducing poverty and improving innovation. It doesn't mean that per se innovation automatically reduces poverty.
Great, and we still have a couple more questions, and I think we have 5 minutes. So I'll try and I think I'll ask the last 2 questions from the audience in the chat. Actually, I think Hungru, this is a question I was going to read. So if you'd like to ask your own question, that would be great.
Thank you, Professor Philippe. I have actually my question is about competition policy. Because we found after during the post-COVID time, we found a glimmer. Well, on the one hand, we found more and more new products, new technology come up, and on the other hand, we found more and more the bigger, we call it big tech, become more and more bigger, more and more dominated in the digital markets. So how to deal with this situation? How to steal the power of creative distraction? The power of the creative distraction.
So we discussed that a bit in chapter 4 and chapter 6. In fact, there is a very interesting book by Richard Gilbert, and we have a whole box, where we summarize the book of, you cannot do justice to a book in a box, obviously, but at least where we give, a few paragraphs on Gilbert's book. The challenge is to really invent a new competition policy which is adapted to the digital era. The problem, the pitfall of competition policy was that it was very much based on market definition and market share. Usually we would get at you if your market share is too high. It's not a great competition policy because, for example, if you have what I call a contestable market, you could have a very high market share, but still you have to charge, you cannot go above the limit price because otherwise there will be entry automatically. So market share is not a great, criterion for competition policy. So you should move, and that's what Gilbert proposed, to a competition policy where when you decide to allow or forbid a merger and acquisition, you would look at the effects that this merger has on subsequent entry and innovation. If you see, that's not obvious to see whether it stifles innovation and entry, then you can get at it. You can say, no, that cannot happen. You see what I mean? So it might mean also breaking up. It might mean also data sharing. So there are various tools that could be contemplated to make sure that the current superstar firms, will not continue to stifle new entry and new innovation. It could be to change the rules for merger and acquisition, possibly some breakup, and certainly regulation on data sharing. Those are certainly things to consider. But I'm not a specialist of competition policy myself. I've worked a bit on that, but it's really about adapting competition policy to the digital era. You cannot just do it the way you used to do it. You see, it's very interesting that growth does not just result from technological revolution. It results from a technological revolution combined with appropriate institutions. If the competition policy or other institutions do not adapt to the technological revolution, the revolution, instead of boosting growth, becomes an obstacle to growth. And that's what happened with IT and AI. And so that's a discussion that we need to have.
Thank you very much for that, Philippe. And I will just ask the last and final question as we only have 2 more minutes.
Yeah,
so someone in the chat was asking, economist Mariana Mazzucato stresses that the role of the state in fostering stresses that the role of the state is essential in fostering fundamental innovation. What are your views on that?
Absolutely. I think the state has a role to play. I mean, of course, the state has a role to play because we know that if I innovate, I get monopoly profits for the time that I am monopolic. Even though I induce permanent progress, technological progress, I reap the private benefits only from a limited period. So the private incentives to innovate tend to be lower than the social incentives. So only this justifies public intervention, obviously. So you need public intervention. We discussed that a lot in chapter 14 and 15 of the book. There is a role of the state as an investor in education, in health, in flex security, I mentioned, also in industrial policy. But we discuss in the book, how can you make industrial policy pro-competition? You see, you need the state also to enforce competition, okay? So, but you also need civil society. Because the state alone, you have no guarantee that it will do the right things and that it will not be captured by incumbent firms. So you need the state, but you also need civil society, but you need the firms. You need the triangle. So it's good to talk about the state, but you need to talk about the 3 ends of the triangle: the firm, the state, and the civil society.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I know I speak on behalf of probably everyone here. This is a wonderful presentation and really interesting ideas to dive deeper into. So thank you all again for your questions and for attending today. We hope that you'll continue to engage with the CID Speaker Series. We are hosting our next Speaker Series on Friday, October 1st, as I said, with Diane Calvi, who's the president and CEO of Village Enterprise. Diane will be speaking on entrepreneurship, innovation, and evidence to drive poverty alleviation. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you for the CID Speaker Series next time.
Okay, thanks so much. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.